Now for our guest speaker today. The topic is how secure is Canada's Arctic? And Dr. Adam Lajeunesse will be giving this presentation. He's in Colorado, so he's coming in to us by Zoom. He is a PhD associate professor and a coordinator of the Public Policy and Governance program at St. Francis Xavier University. He holds research chair in Arctic and Marine Security at the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government at St. Francis Xavier. And he's a Fulbright scholar where he's engaged in a program of work examining Russian and Chinese information warfare in the Arctic, work begun in 2024 as a visiting Killam scholar at the University of Calgary. Welcome, Dr. Lajeunesse.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction. Let me check. Is the screen sharing okay? Can everybody hear me? Yes, I think I see some thumbs up there, so I'll proceed. Thanks so much for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today, if only digitally. What I'd like to talk about for the next hour or so is a subject that is certainly topical these days. That's Canadian Arctic sovereignty and security. Now, we've seen over the last several months just how important this has become. So, the most recent federal election, which just ended, for the first time in as long as I can remember, sovereignty and security in the North was actually at the heart of that campaign. We have an American president that is now talking about annexing big chunks of the Arctic. We have concerns over the Russians and the Chinese in the Arctic. That is more of a security than a sovereignty concern. But needless to say that the entire ecosystem is certainly hotter than ever before, to use the standard terrible Arctic pun. So what I'd like to do is talk about the history of Canadian Arctic sovereignty. We talk about sovereignty all the time. It's in the newspapers, but what exactly does it mean? And the reality is, I'd say from my experience, 90% of the time when a journalist or a politician talks about sovereignty, they actually get it wrong. So I'd like to run you through the history of Canada's Arctic sovereignty so you understand what we really mean when we use that term. Then I'd like to go into some of the contemporary security fears. What are the defense considerations, the safety concerns, the security issues that are emerging with the Russians, the Chinese, and third-party actors? So what's going on in the North, and how did we get there? So let's start with this happy gentleman right here. This is Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State for the United States government. 2019, Mike Pompeo goes up in front of an audience at the Arctic Council, and he does something that was very unusual. He challenges Canada's sovereignty over the Northwest Passage, calls it illegitimate. Now, this isn't actually out of character for American policy. The United States has not recognized Canada's Arctic sovereignty in 80 years, since the issue became an issue in the 1950s. The United States has never recognized Canadian Arctic sovereignty. But what's unusual is the fact that we have a Secretary of State going out of his way to tell everybody that. Historically speaking, the Americans have very quietly disagreed with Canada. So this is different. In 2019, the Americans are going out of their way to tell everyone that they actually don't accept Canada's Arctic sovereignty. Now, around the same time, other things are happening too. This is former Secretary of the Navy Richard Spencer. And over a period of a couple of years, the US Navy changed its Arctic policy a couple of times. The first Arctic policy that came out was very safety oriented. It was very cooperative. The world was a cooperative place, according to this policy. We were going to work with the Russians, we're going to work with everybody. And a couple of years later, a revision to this policy comes out, and it's much more, it's much sharper. the world is now an uncooperative place. The Russians are a security challenge. There's more emphasis on hard security and defense. And he's walking out of a Senate, I think it was a Senate committee meeting. And a reporter asked him, well, you've got, like, what has changed in the Arctic to require such a radical shift in policy? So what's changed? And he just said, well, the damn thing melted. That's what's changed. And of course, it's a bit of an oversimplification, but there's some truth to that. The Arctic is melting. The sea ice is declining. It is becoming more accessible. And with that accessibility is coming new actors, new dangers, new possibilities, and of course, new interests. So, where did this disagreement come from? The fact that the United States is not willing to accept Canadian sovereignty, the fact that it's pushing a little bit harder than it has ever pushed before. And now we're talking about new operations, new threats, and new dynamics in the region. Here is, in a nutshell, the big disagreement. This is the sovereignty disagreement, the difference of positions between Canada and the United States. Now, for Canada, sovereignty means that the Arctic archipelago and the waters in between them are entirely Canadian. Those waters are as Canadian as Lake Winnipeg. And you look at that map that I have on the very bottom there, inside of those pink lines, everything within those lines are Canadian waters, historic internal waters over which we have absolute authority. Now, those pink lines are called straight baselines. It's a principle used in international law to delimit maritime jurisdictions. Now, the American position is visualized up on the top. So Canada does not enjoy sovereignty over all of the waters within the Arctic archipelago. We enjoy sovereignty over our territorial waters, which stretch 12 nautical miles out from every island. And you can see those little red lines. Everything within the red lines there, that's what the Americans think constitutes Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic. And through those territorial waters, which do overlap in places, the Americans think an international strait runs through that area. So warships, Coast Guard vessels, submarines, cargo ships, anything can pass through that international strait without asking permission from the Canadian government. That is the sovereignty dispute. That's the crux of it, and that's what we're talking about. So let's bring it back about 70 or 80 years and ask, well, where did that come from? Where did that disagreement come from, and how did it evolve? Well, the first half of the 20th century, Arctic sovereignty was not necessarily as hot a topic as it is today, but it was certainly an issue. The problem was that successive Canadian governments didn't really know what Canadian Arctic sovereignty really meant. So there were three questions that many governments asked whenever this came up. And the first was, what exactly are our waters? We didn't really know. Why were they ours? We knew we wanted to claim them, but we didn't know how we would do that, on what legal basis. International law was less evolved and less developed than it is today. And then, of course, how do we actually secure that claim? Our presence in the North in the early 20th century was not, as you would imagine, particularly strong. It was something we could comfortably ignore, however, up until the 1950s, and the Cold War starts to actually bring a lot of activity up in the North. Now, in the first half of the century, we tried something very creative. It was something called the sector principle. Now, here's a map from 1904. And what you're seeing there with that big blue arrow is a line that's a national boundary line that stretches all the way from the Yukon up until it reaches the North Pole and then back again to hit Ellesmere Island. Now, this boundary line represents what was called the sector. The idea within external affairs was that we could claim this whole pie-shaped wedge that included all the waters within the Northwest Passages and all of this chunk of the Arctic Ocean. and we would claim it by drawing this line up to the North Pole. Now, this was never legislated. It was never official. There's no law in Canada that draws this line. It was very informal. It was an idea. We'd love to do this if we could figure out how to do this in international law. So here you can see the sector. This, for 50 years, was what Canada implied was its Arctic waters. Interestingly enough, here's a modern map. That line is still there. This is, to my knowledge, the only boundary line anywhere in the world on any map published by a country that is not a real boundary. It's very curious. Canada does not claim sovereignty over any of those waters in the Arctic Ocean based on that boundary line stretching up to the North Pole. It's a cartographic curiosity. Why we have this still, I don't know. But that sector principle didn't survive much past the 1950s, 1960s. Over the 50s, early Cold War, the Soviets, the Americans were up in the Arctic. We have to actually solidify some of those claims. We have to answer some of those questions. What are our waters? What do we do about it? It came to a head in the 50s when the Soviets and the Americans started floating ice floes full of scientists through that sector. Is this a sovereignty violation? If we own these waters, it is, but we're not really sure if we own these waters. Can we do anything about it? At one point, Lester Pearson, who was then a junior policy analyst in foreign affairs or external affairs, as it was called, suggested a solution, which was to fly an airplane over a Soviet ice floe and drop Christmas trees on them. It was Christmas at the time, as a way of welcoming them to Canada and asserting Canadian Arctic sovereignty. Now, the decision was vetoed by the Department of National Defense because they didn't want to accidentally kill a Soviet scientist by dropping a tree on them, because they thought that might create an international incident. But it was a clever idea. Barring that, what external affairs did do was undertake a couple of years of study to try and figure out what exactly are our waters. Now, this was getting more and more important because the Americans, at this point in the mid to the late 1950s, were surging hundreds of ships every year into the Canadian Arctic to build the Distant Early Warning Line, a series of radar stations, the very top line there you can see on that map, to detect incoming Soviet bombers. So the question for the Canadian government was, should these Americans be asking our permission to be here? What are the requirements? What's the structure by which we can govern these American operations? So it was a very uncertain, it was a very stressful time for external affairs, trying to figure out what waters were ours. Was it just the Northwest Passage, or is it this huge chunk of the Arctic Ocean that we wanted to claim as our own? We didn't really know yet. How were we going to claim them? What was the legal basis by which we could say, hey, these are ours? Well, we didn't really know yet. Now, the answer comes in the early 1950s with an evolution in international law. The Norwegians claim successfully that those waters that you can see in the map, right here at the Skagerrak, the top of the Norwegian archipelagos, that these were Norwegian waters. And the International Court of Justice at the time says, yes, we accept Norwegian sovereignty over those waters within those straight baselines, because the Norwegians have used those waters since time immemorial and can show a history of foreign acceptance that those were Norwegian waters. So you look at that archipelago, that series of islands, that indented coast at the top of Norway, and then you look at the Canadian Arctic archipelago. So go back. Now, if you squint your eyes and really, really blur your focus, maybe you can kind of see a certain commonality. Now, this map is from 1955. It was never published. This was never legislated, but this was the Canadian government's attempt to draw their own baselines in line with the Norwegian precedent. So if the Norwegians can block off this archipelago, maybe we can too. It's an archipelago. It's just much, much, much bigger. Now, the problem here is if the Canadian government comes out and says, good news, these are Canadian waters, we're formalizing it, we're drawing lines on the map, they risk an international challenge. Well, what will happen if we come out with this and the Americans or the British or others refuse to recognize this? There's a very serious concern that lasts for decades that any explicit claim to waters, which the Americans, the British, and certain European countries don't recognize, would result in a challenge which would damage the Canadian claim, create a political crisis, and maybe even damage Canadian Arctic sovereignty. So the Canadian government draws these lines, they develop policies behind closed doors, but in public, everything is very ambiguous. Canadian governments will say, we own these waters, but they'll never say why they own them or how, on what basis. So what emerges over the 1950s and 60s is something I've called gradual acquisition, where we gradually acquire sovereignty through a series of acts of occupation. We're going to let time sort of ally with the Canadian government. Here's a couple of useful quotes sort of exemplifying this general policy from a couple of key policymakers or divisions, basically saying, let's just leave it be, and gradually, without people even noticing, Canada will strengthen its Arctic sovereignty through occupation and precedent. The problem, of course, is that you've got all of these American ships using the Northwest Passage. What do you ask them to do? Do you ask them to request permission? Do you tell them that they're allowed to be there? Politically and diplomatically, it's quite tricky. Now, what evolves over the 1950s and 60s is this don't ask, don't tell policy, where the Americans know the Canadians want to claim these waters, but they refuse to accept Canadian sovereignty. Now, the Canadians know the Americans won't accept their sovereignty, but if this comes to a head, and if this comes out into public, then it's going to create a crisis and it's going to stop the US Navy and Coast Guard from effectively building this distant early warning line. It's going to wreck continental defense cooperation. It's going to create a political problem. Nobody wants this to happen. And so the question is strategically ignored. The Americans don't ask Canada what its position on Arctic sovereignty is. And Canada doesn't tell the Americans what its position on Arctic sovereignty is. And nobody's fooled. Everybody understands the dance that's happening, but they both comfortably ignore the topic and they pretend it's not an issue so that continental defense cooperation can proceed. So why is it that the Americans in the 50s and 60s aren't willing to accept Canadian sovereignty over these waters? I mean, they're not exactly important waters at the time. There's no international shipping. Climate change has not yet melted them, so they're iced over for about 10, sometimes even 11 months of the year, depending on where you are. Now, the reality in the 50s and still today is that when Canada talks about Arctic maritime sovereignty, it's talking about the Arctic. When the Americans are talking about it, they're talking about the Straits of Malacca and the various international choke points around the world. The Americans have never really cared about the Arctic passages. They see them historically and still today as a source of precedent. Now, I've seen a lot of documents from the US State Department over the years in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and 80s, and the message is pretty clear. And it's, look, guys, we're not all that concerned that you're going to exclude us from the Perry Channel. That's just not an issue. But as soon as we, the United States, accept Canadian sovereignty in the North, the next day we are going to have people from the Philippines, from Indonesia, and from other places around the world knocking on our door saying, look, you've accepted Canadian maritime sovereignty. Why in the world won't you accept sovereignty over the internal waters of, say, the Philippines or other more strategically important areas around the world? And this is something the Americans cared about a lot, particularly in the 50s, 60s, 70s, as the law of the sea was still evolving. So the Philippines and Indonesia were very important considerations. Like these are archipelagos. Both of those countries were trying to claim all of the waters within their not Arctic, pardon, within their archipelagos as internal as Canada was. But for the United States, this would close off strategically and economically important sea routes. Here you've got a map showing the voyage of USS Triton. This is a nuclear attack submarine. This was the very first submerged circumnavigation of the entire world in 1960. And you can look at Asia, and what you'll notice is that this submarine went right through the Philippines and through the Indonesian archipelagos. And that wasn't a coincidence. That's not a random route choice. It would have been easier to go south of Australia, really. But they went through there as a demonstration to the Philippines and to Indonesia to say, we do not accept your right to claim these waters as your own. These are free international straits we can move through whenever we want. And so the Canadian Arctic is just part of this whole global push on the part of the United States to maximize freedom of the oceans. So when you think about Arctic sovereignty from Washington's perspective, it's not about the Arctic. It's about the big global picture. So there you've got the Triton's route through Indonesia and the Philippines. Now, a part of this, of course, is Russia. The Russian Arctic Straits, you can see there in the bottom map, also, just like Canada, claimed by the Russians as historic internal waters. During the Cold War, the Americans did not want to lose access to those straits. The Russians were enemies. The US was sending submarines right up close and through those straits. The Americans knew that as soon as they recognized Canadian sovereignty over the Arctic archipelago, our Arctic archipelago, there was no way they could reasonably deny the Russians that same claim. So there's the Russian straits that are claimed by Moscow as internal, just as we claim the Northwest Passage as internal. Great line from 1963, basically saying international law be damned. There's no way the United States can recognize Canadian sovereignty because that would kick us out of those key areas north of Russia. And so what results from all of this is Joe Clark's words, actually, a gentleman's agreement where the US and Canada strategically ignore the issue. They smooth out continental defense and they do everything in their power to keep this issue from turning into a fight. And it worked. It worked for decades. As long as the issue was not front and center, and as long as the press didn't get hold of this, and as long as Canadians didn't turn this into a nationalistic issue, it worked at a sort of an operational level. The whole system collapses in 1969 when this ship, SS Manhattan, a 100,000-ton ice-breaking supertanker, goes through the Northwest Passage to test the ability to move oil back and forth through the Northwest Passage after the big oil strikes at Prudhoe Bay in northern Alaska. This upsets the apple cart because all of a sudden it turns into a political issue. Canadians are incensed, enraged. They inaccurately assume that this was an American challenge. It wasn't. The Manhattan they didn't ask permission, but there was months and months and months of planning with the Canadian government. The Trudeau government actually was very happy to have the Manhattan move through because, of course, that government was also looking to develop the oil, gas, and resources of the Canadian Arctic, and a sea route would actually be very helpful. But it turns into a popular cause célèbre. Canadians demand a response to this, and they demand a more forceful approach to sovereignty. But for the same reason as Canada in the 1950s wasn't going to claim sovereignty, that same reason is that they were worried about the American reaction. Well, what if we drew those baselines that I talked about, drew the lines around the Arctic archipelago, And the Americans said no. The Nixon government was not exactly a big fan of Trudeau the Elder. And the two foreign services talking to each other, they realized that this was going to turn into a diplomatic crisis and probably a reference to the International Court of Justice. And if you lose at the ICJ, that's the end of Canadian Arctic sovereignty. So nobody wanted to roll those dice. And so even after the Manhattan, the Trudeau government does not actually claim sovereignty over the Northwest Passage. They bring in the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act. They do a few things to assert jurisdiction, but there's never actually a formal claim to Arctic sovereignty. Now you've got the two governments fighting over Arctic sovereignty for the first time. And the fight lasts several years, actually. The back and forth, sometimes it's behind closed doors, but the diplomats are still fighting. However, you've got a different level of cooperation at the defense level. So while the diplomats are arguing over the legal precedent of sovereignty and jurisdiction, the two militaries are actually continuing their decades-long history of really close defense cooperation. This is a very cool map. I got it from the US Navy. I'm reasonably confident I wasn't supposed to get it. I think they gave it to me by accident. This is a map showing all of the American submarine transits in the Arctic archipelago and the circumpolar north up until I think it's 1983. So what you can see there is actually the American Navy is still very active in the Canadian Arctic in the 1970s, 1980s. And on the left, you've got a history of American submarine operations in the Arctic, with the red bar being Canadian voyages. So they're still there quite a bit. So as the politicians are arguing, the two militaries are actually cooperating. And all of these voyages are cooperative with the Canadian military. The Canadian military knows they're there. They're working with the Canadian military to develop different detection systems geared towards the Soviets. You've got this dichotomy of politicians fighting over the status of the waters and the military doing what they did in the 1950s, which is just saying, forget it. We're not going to worry about sovereignty. Let's focus on working together and defeating the Soviets. Series of maps. I'm just going to flip through them just because they're kind of neat. These are all of the known American submarine transits over the 1970s and 1980s. Kind of a rough map. I drew them up myself, but it's kind of cool to see where they went. And they went almost everywhere. Almost all of the navigable channels, you can see American submarines with Canadian participation have used as useful routes through the Arctic archipelago. The Mendel Rivers was somewhere in McClintock Channel. I don't have enough information to tell you where. Spadefish in 84. So you've got a decade or two of this really close cooperation. The political fight dies down by the late 1970s, and the issue kind of goes back into stasis. Once again, the voyage of an American ship upsets the apple cart, as it were. 1985, the US Coast Guard icebreaker Polar Sea, still in service, goes through the Northwest Passage. This isn't a challenge to Canadian Arctic sovereignty. It's often held up as one. It's not. The Coast Guard, the US Coast Guard, just needed to get its ship from point A to point B. And the only way to get it there was through the Northwest Passage. The Coast Guard had some stuff to do in North Alaska. They needed to resupply a base in Greenland. The only way there was through the Canadian Arctic. So they approached the Canadians and said, look, let's forget the sovereignty issue. Can we just send our ship through? Sure, they worked it out together. The bureaucrats came up with a nice arrangement. Nobody thought that this was going to be a big deal. Well, it turns out to be a big deal. This becomes a crisis, this time for the Mulroney government. Once again, the media screams sovereignty challenge. It was not, but that's how the media ran with it. And once again, the government was pressured to do something. Now, this time, the Mulroney government goes one step further than the Trudeau government did in 69 and actually draws those baselines. actually legislates Canadian sovereignty. So for the first time ever in 1985, the Canadian government answers those questions that it was asking in the 1950s. What are Canadian waters? Well, that's them right there. That's the map. Defined. Finally. On what basis are they Canadian? Well, again, for the first time ever, the Mulroney government actually provides a legal basis for those Arctic waters. They're based on a couple of things. The first is that Norwegian precedent I talked about earlier. We can draw these lines around an archipelago. There's a precedent in international law. There's a debate over whether our Arctic is too big to do that, but it's a legal debate. The second, of course, is indigenous use, sea ice use and occupation. Over the 1970s, the idea of historic sea ice use becomes more and more important. This is a great map from the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs. And essentially, what this is a map of historic Inuit sea ice use and occupation. So the idea here is that, well, Canadians, in this case, Inuit, have used these waters since time immemorial, since before written history. They have used, traveled on, hunted on, even lived on these waters. This is an important component in Canada's historic claim that these are internal historic waters. So on those two bases, on the basis of the drawing of straight baselines and historic use and occupancy, Brian Mulroney is able to go to the world and say, okay, this is it. This is exactly what we mean when we say Canadian Arctic sovereignty. Now, the Americans still don't agree for the same reason they didn't agree in the 1960s. And this time you've got two very friendly people in the White House and Parliament. Mulroney and Reagan are good buddies. They're looking to find a solution. The last thing Reagan wants to do is get into a fight with his good buddy Brian. But they still can't agree to accept Canadian sovereignty for the same reason. As soon as the Americans do that, it creates, in their mind, a precedent that hurts American freedom of navigation everywhere else in the world. So the two sides go back and forth for 3 years trying to find a way to accept Canadian sovereignty or control of some kind, while at the same time not setting that very damaging precedent that the Americans are anxious to avoid. And for the most part, they fail. They cannot bridge that gap. Those two red lines are just too intractable. The Americans won't accept Canadian sovereignty. Canada won't accept anything short of sovereignty. What they do arrive at is something that is still functional today. This is still the way that we manage American icebreaker voyages so that we don't have a repetition of the Polar Sea or the Manhattan crisis. What they arrive at is a little bit of a compromise, and they find a bit of a loophole, and it's quite a clever one. And it turns into what's called the Canada-US Arctic Cooperation Agreement, which was signed in 1988. And the loophole is basically this. The Americans say, look, Canada demands that we ask for permission to go through the Northwest Passage. Canada's happy to have us there, but we have to ask permission. We can't use the word permission because the word permission implies that we accept sovereignty, right? That's the crux of the dispute. But a very clever American negotiator realizes, well, if our icebreakers are going through to conduct scientific research, then we can ask permission because the American understanding of international law, the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, says you do need to ask permission to conduct scientific research. And so they frame this brilliant agreement whereby the United States will always ask permission to go through the Northwest Passage while conducting scientific research, right? A little bit of a footnote there. That way, both sides win. The Americans can say, look, we are not accepting Canadian sovereignty. We're just requesting permission to conduct research on Canada's continental shelf. We have to do that for every country. Meanwhile, a Canadian government can say, look, they requested permission. So both sides are looking at the same agreement in a different way. Now, both sides know what the other side is doing, but that's the clever diplomatic dance. So this comes out in 88, and this is still the way that we manage America's presence in the Northwest Passage. And I mean, it's almost been laughably applied on several occasions. So in 1988, the Polar Star, the Polar Sea's twin, is going through the Northwest Passage. It's damaged. Its engine is damaged. It's making an emergency transit. It's not conducting scientific research, but the request for permission to transit still says, hey, we're conducting scientific research. Give me a break. The Coast Guard cutter Maple in 2017, an American ship, again, going through the Northwest Passage to conduct scientific research. The Coast Guard had to go, a US Coast Guard colleague told me this once. They had to go and find someone to conduct some scientific research. They didn't care, just conduct any research so that we can tell the Canadians we're doing some scientific research because we needed to get the Maple from point A to point B. Here's the relevant elements within international law. So on the bottom there, you're going to see this is an actual cut and paste from one of those American requests to transit based on scientific research. So it's a technicality. It's a very clever technicality, but it's a way of taking that intractable political dispute and putting it aside so that we can get down to doing business in the Arctic as we have for 70 years. It's a great solution, but it's temporary. We haven't actually solved the problem, right? We come back to Mike Pompeo in 2019 challenging Canadian sovereignty. So obviously the issue, the fundamental underlying issue is still unresolved. So why can't we solve it? Why have countries like Canada, the US, which are close friends and allies, why have we not been able to solve this? Well, we've kind of tried everything. And there's always a few ideas that are floated in public, like, hey, why don't we do this? And maybe this will work to create a solution. They're often floated by people who haven't done the history on the subject. So what if we offered the Americans free passage through the Northwest Passage? So you guys recognize Canadian sovereignty and you can use it whenever you want. Well, we tried that in 63 and 74 and 86. We tried that many times. Again, the problem is the Americans don't really care about the Northwest Passage. It's not about the Arctic. It's about the big picture. It's about the world and freedom of navigation. We've also tried saying, hey guys, look, the Northwest Passage as Canadian waters would be much safer because if it was ours and universally understood to be ours, we could keep the Soviets out or the Russians or the Chinese today. Well, we tried that too on several occasions. In 64, the Secretary of State said to External Affairs, and I love this little quotation here, he said, like, look, we get it. It would be safer if these were Canadian waters, but the United States recognizes the rights of Soviet warships to be 3 miles off Cape Kennedy space facilities. That's how important the right of international travel across the high seas is to us. Soviet activities in the Arctic, in the grand scheme of things, secondary concern. It's the same way today. And then, of course, well, what if we told the Americans we would do more to assert our control and security in the North? Once again, you've got to look at the big picture. So this is the sticking point. This is the irresolvable, fundamental, legal and political question that the two countries have been totally unable to resolve, despite spending years over the last 7 years negotiating, like serious in-depth negotiations, have been unable to find a solution. So the question today is not much changed from when it was in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. We could go to court, right? We could bring this issue to the International Court of Justice and ask for adjudication. The problem with that is we don't know which way they would go. External Affairs has run a few tests over the years. They've asked experts to weigh in, and the best they've ever been able to get is an estimate of, well, there's about an 80% chance we'd win. Is there any Canadian government that wants to take a 20% chance that they would lose the Arctic waters as sovereign internal Canadian waters? I don't think so. We've talked about this with the Americans in the past. Even for the Americans, the irony is they can't win. So for us, we're very cautious. We don't want to take the risk. But for the Americans, no matter what happens, they lose. So either international arbitration accepts the Canadian position, in which case the Americans lose because this sets a precedent, which is damaging to them when it comes to global freedom of the seas, or at least they think it's damaging. But even if they won and they opened the Canadian Arctic archipelago and the Northwest Passage to foreign activity, all of a sudden, what that means is now the Chinese and the Russians are legally allowed to send cruise missile firing submarines or bombers or icebreakers or anything they want right through the Northwest Passage, through the heart of Arctic North America, which is also bad for the United States. So the Americans have also always been very reticent to bring this to court. Neither power wants to go. And so we maintain that old modus vivendi, the gentleman's agreement. Nobody wants a fight because we both know it can't possibly end well. And then we get Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump, and I'll throw this up because a colleague of mine and I wrote an article recently saying, well, what would happen if Trump actually threatened that modus vivendi? And he is a fundamental break from the historical pattern that I've drawn because he operates so differently from any other American president ever. So from the 50s all the way up until Trump, you have this very structured, very thoughtful recognition on both Canada and the Americans' part that what we have now is an equilibrium, a balance. Nobody has won. And that equilibrium is the best we can do. The gentleman's agreement is the best we can do. The Canadians have not tried to win this argument. They have not forced the Americans or tried to force the Americans to request permission to go into the Northwest Passage. The Americans have never forced the issue by, for instance, sailing a warship through the Northwest Passage, flying the biggest flag it could fly, like they do in the South China Sea, and yelling to the world, we do not accept Canadian sovereignty. Neither side has done that. Neither side has really tried to upset the balance because both have recognized there's no winning. A fight would do immeasurable damage to the political relationship and to Northern continental defense. And why in the world would we do that? Donald Trump operates foreign policy very differently. Uh, Long-term thinking is not his forte. Transactional agreements with immediate gratification, this is something that the president does understand. And so the last couple of Trump presidencies, what we're watching now is the possibility, hasn't happened obviously, but the possibility that this multi-decade long balance between the two political positions might be exploded by an American president who's looking to win, even if winning is not necessarily winning in the long term. So again, conjectural, but that is something I can tell you for sure. Academics are watching, experts, Canadian government personnel are watching how Donald Trump changes America's historic approach to the Arctic. Now, we look at what he's doing with Greenland. Um, a threat to Canada's sovereignty Northwest Passage is not the most extreme thing he'd be doing in the Arctic. And so that is the legal, political, and historical context behind the sovereignty issue. So, sovereignty is about ownership and jurisdiction over, in this case, the Northwest Passage and the maritime areas of the Arctic archipelago. Now, there's a clear nexus between that sovereignty question and then security. Like, that's the second side of the coin. Sovereignty is legal, jurisdictional questions. Security is defense and safety. Over the last, I'd say, 15 years, the big security question has been about resources. Who controls them? Are they ours? Are they up for grabs? Could they be stolen? This was a big deal in the early 20 teens, 2000s. It's kind of faded away in recent years, but you're still going to see newspaper articles about the security of Canadian resources. And here's where most of them are, at least the oil and gas. Across the circumpolar north, the US Geological Survey really famously came out in 2008 with this assertion that about 13% of all of our undiscovered oil, a third of our undiscovered natural gas is sitting in the circumpolar Arctic. So in North America, that's all north of Alaska, in the Beaufort Sea in Canada, the Sverdrup Basin in the Arctic Islands. This is the big question. Who owns all of this oil and gas? Is it in danger? Could our sovereignty be so weak as to permit another country to come in and actually steal some of this? And there is still a disagreement over who owns what. Now, this disagreement isn't over the waters because, of course, the status of the Arctic waters actually doesn't determine who owns the oil and gas maybe underneath them. Here we're talking about continental shelves. It's a different kind of jurisdiction. Who owns the seabed and all of the oil and gas and minerals, the rare earth nodules? Who owns that stuff? And there's still a disagreement that's being worked out actually quite amicably, believe it or not, between the different Arctic states. So here's a good map showing the overlap. The Danes, who control Greenland, have pushed their claim way into the Russian side. The Russians have pushed their claim way into the Canadian side. Actually, this map is out of date. The Russian claim is even more than what you see there. And so all of the different Arctic countries have these big overlapping chunks of the Arctic Ocean that they are claiming. Now, this is unlikely to be resolved violently. This is going through a process managed by the United Nations, and it's probably going to take a couple more decades to figure out who owns what. And at the end of the day, in a nutshell, what has to happen through this process is the different countries are going to have to talk to each other. This can only be resolved through bilateral or multilateral negotiation. How this is going to shake out, I don't know. But the question of resources is, believe it or not, actually being resolved pretty amicably through negotiation and conversation. It's also overrated. Every time someone talks about the future resource boom in the Arctic, they kind of out themselves as somebody who doesn't really know what they're talking about, particularly when they're talking about all the oil and gas at the top of the world. Here at the North Pole, all of these overlapping claims, billions of dollars worth of oil. Give me a break. One, we don't actually know what's there. No one has done any real resource surveying. Two, the price of oil, the price that oil would have to be to economically exploit those areas of overlap at the North Pole. I mean, we're talking about $300, $400 a barrel. So the North Pole, I mean, it is about 2,400 kilometers away from Canadian or Russian infrastructure. It is far away. It is as far away and as difficult to access as pretty much anywhere else on the planet. Now, there have been a couple of attempts to get at Arctic oil over the last 15 years. The Russians are trying in the Kara Sea. You can see up at the top. Shell tried in the 2000s to get some oil out of the Chukchi Sea. Shell drilled one well. I think it cost them $8 billion. It was a dry well. The Russians pegged the Kara Sea development at something like $100 billion. The cost of actually getting oil and gas from the Arctic is astronomically high. And quite frankly, we kind of have a lot of oil and gas. The oil sands have decades, if not centuries, of productivity left. The Americans still have a lot of shale. I would warn you to not buy into the Arctic oil and gas bonanza as much as media often likes to push this. Now, there's other resources there, but oil and gas, I don't think so. That being said, the region is certainly seeing expanded security concerns. So here's a map of all of the new or refurbished Arctic bases being built or refurbished in northern Russia. These are not geared towards attacking Canada or stealing Canadian resources, but they are geared towards protecting local Russian resources. All of those oil and gas deposits that you can see in green across the Russian north, and even the maritime deposits, that's the future of the Russian state. That's all Russia has. John McCain once called them a gas station with an army. There's some truth to that. The future of the Russian state, as it's currently set up, is based on continuing oil and gas production. And most of that is going to come out of the Arctic region because that's what's left. That's what they got left. So a lot of Russian militarization across the north is it's an evidence of insecurity as much as aggression. It's inward looking and based on the need to protect what they see as the future of their state, which is the resource basin across the North American Arctic. That being said, you do see increased potential for Russian aggression across the north over the last, I would say, 15 years in particular, certainly since 2014, the first invasion of Ukraine. You've got a significant Russian capability growth in the Arctic, long-range cruise missiles, bombers, air defense, which are primarily defensive, but also a big reinvestment in their nuclear attack, cruise missile, and ballistic missile submarine capability. That's one of the things the Russians have spent a lot of money on is maintaining and upgrading their nuclear submarine capability, which is really at the heart of any state's ability to operate militarily in the Arctic. Because, of course, nuclear submarines are the only vessel that can go under the ice for a long period of time and operate there comfortably and safely. So, what exactly would the Russians be doing with nuclear submarines in the Arctic? So, here's a very rough map I actually just drew up this morning for you folks. And this is the fear that dates back to the 1970s. You'll see similar maps like this from American, Canadian militaries in the 1970s. And as recently as a couple of years ago, a couple of former commanders of NORAD published a very good article called Hardening the Shield. And their concern was basically the same as their predecessors in the 1970s. There's a couple of things that the Russians could do, just as the Soviets could, with those submarines up in the Arctic. And this is the principal defense threat, like the hard security military threat that the North Americans are worried about. There's a couple of things. The first is those arrows I've got up there, is that the Russians could use the Arctic as a transit route to go from their ports around Greenland into the Atlantic Ocean in order to attack shipping. Now, the reason they would do that rather than going by Iceland on the other side is that there's a heck of a lot of NATO anti-submarine warfare capability on the other side. So this is kind of a backdoor. Now, the second consideration, I've got those three just kind of big blobs sitting there. Those are the ideal missile firing locations for Soviet or Russian cruise missiles. So if you were to park a submarine there in Hudson's Bay, Labrador Sea, Beaufort Sea, that is where you could strike a lot of the key nodes of transportation, command and control across North America with long-range cruise missiles. So a cruise missile gives you the ability to blow something up undetected. So they're very hard to detect. They travel very low to the ground. as opposed to a ballistic missile, which could be launched from Russia to hit North America, but we'd see it coming. We'd have a lot of warning. Cruise missiles, particularly the new breed of hypersonic weapons that are just being developed, present a new threat that Northcom and NORAD are very worried about. So, once again, I bring you back to this map. This is what the Americans and the Canadians, to a lesser extent, because we don't have submarines, are really worried about. We're watching the development of those Russian submarines. We're watching the development of their cruise missile technology, and we are worrying that the Arctic could be a transit location or a firing station. And so the Americans are reinvesting in the North, putting more submarines up there, and they're starting to retrace some of those lines from the Cold War. So that's the defense threat. I mean, there's other defense threats, but that's kind of the big one. That being said, what we're talking about with cruise missile firing submarines is basically full-blown Third World War. It's a very high impact scenario, but it's much less likely than what we're seeing emerging in what's called the hybrid security dynamic. So the hybrid security threats that we're seeing in the Arctic are much less consequential than Russian cruise missile firing submarines, but they're much more likely to develop. And in fact, some of them are developing right now. So the big ones I'd point out are proxy actors, which is a civilian actor of some sort who works secretly for a government doing something in the Arctic at arm's length from, say, Beijing or Moscow. Illegal fishing is not a serious concern right now, but we look 5, 10 years in the future, and I would highlight this as probably the most important security threat, concern that's emerging in the North. And then, particularly with the Chinese, we're seeing illegal or dual purpose maritime scientific research. So this is Chinese icebreakers conducting civilian research. Much of it is perfectly legitimate civilian, non-military work, but also with military applications. So these are the big hybrid security threats that the Canadian military and the American military is watching in the region. So I said one of the most pressing, in my view at least, is illegal fishing. Fisheries across the world are collapsing. They're being overfished by illegal or untracked or unreported fishing fleets, of which China runs far and away the biggest such illegal fishing fleets. And you can see kind of a heat map on the left of where that fishery takes place. And then on the right, you can see just kind of a basic map showing the expansion of some commercial fishing stocks up into the Arctic. The central Arctic Ocean, Arctic archipelago, you're seeing salmon popping up there. They've never been there before. So it's almost irrational to assume that those fishing fleets, which are fishing out the world's most productive grounds, will not one day emerge in the American and Canadian Arctic exclusive economic zones. So that's 5, 10 years in the future, but it's a very serious consideration. And how do you deal with that? You're not looking at one big icebreaker that's easy to track and has a very clear line of attribution. It's a Chinese icebreaker, it's a Russian icebreaker. You know who's running the thing. What if you have a fleet of 70 or 700 small fishing ships? They're civilian. Maybe they're supported by the state. We don't really know. We don't have those clear lines of attribution. How do you police or manage or track hundreds of fishing ships? Well, you look at that left-hand map, and that's a problem with that countries all around the world are having. How do you track? How do you police all these vessels? It's like nailing jello to a wall. It's very, very hard to do. And then, of course, you've got all of this new activity across the North. How do you make sure it's safe? Not just secure, but safe. So here's a map just of Northwest Territories with Germany, France, Ireland, Britain inset. Gives you an idea of how big the area is. It's roughly the size of Europe when you add none of it. So huge landmass, not a lot of people. How do you do search and rescue across an area the size of Europe? Here's a good map. Here's Canada's three search and rescue facilities at Victoria, Trenton, and Halifax. So if there is a problem in the central Canadian Arctic archipelago, you're flying 3,100 kilometers just to get there. What if a ship sinks? What if there's a disaster, an accident? Search and rescue, safety is a very, very tricky problem across the north. And all of this new activity is becoming much, much riskier. If you go back to the 1970s, you've got a couple of icebreakers up there, very minimal activity. And the ships that are there generally know how to handle themselves. But now we've got all sorts of new actors, cruise ships, luxury vessels, sailing ships. You had a couple of idiots going through on kayaks and skidoos. You had an American reality TV show where they tried to skidoo, or no, sea-doo across the Northwest Passage. They had to be rescued. These morons, they're rescued all of the time. It's getting much, much more dangerous. So there's the Crystal Serenity. I was aboard actually in 2016. It was very well run, very safe, but 1,700 passengers and crew. How do you rescue them if that ship sinks? Canada, the United States, we've got no ability to rescue thousands of people. I'll give you a fun example out of Greenland. A colleague of mine was in Nuuk for a tabletop exercise, a search and rescue exercise. And the exercise was a ship with 50 people has gone down. We need to go and save those people. My colleague looks out the window and says, but there's a cruise ship in the harbor with 500 people. Why are we practicing rescuing 50? And he was told, well, if we did 500, we're guaranteed to lose. So we want to give ourselves a chance. It's, it would be almost impossible to rescue a big cruise ship of this nature. There's something I did not show to anyone on that cruise ship when I was aboard. These are the circles of death, very roughly drawn, so not scientific by any measurement, but a cruise ship's life craft are motorized, and they've got a certain range. So the red dots are Arctic communities, and the yellow circles are essentially the range of a cruise ship's life raft. So if a ship sinks within those yellow circles, you could conceivably get to a community. But if a ship sunk anywhere along this route outside of the yellow circles, you couldn't possibly get to a community. The life craft simply don't have the range. So you'd be putting ashore in a barren, desolate area filled with polar bears and wolves. Um, with no immediate prospect of rescue. So it is a very dangerous area, not to turn anybody off of an Arctic cruise. They were incredible, but very dangerous with these increasingly complex safety questions. And like I said, you don't just have the big ships like the Serenity, which had its own icebreaker escort, was done very safely. You've got all of these little guys who sail up into the Arctic and need to be rescued all the time, need to be rescued because they want to be adventurers and it rarely ends well for them. So the Coast Guard, which has its own stuff to do, resupplying communities and breaking ice for commercial vessels, is now having to divert its relatively few Arctic icebreakers to save folks like this. So those are the safety considerations. Now, I mentioned earlier the bigger hybrid security concerns. So illegal fishing is a future concern that we're not doing anything about right now, but there's a lot of planning going on. What is going on right now, we see a lot more foreign actors working in or around the Canadian Arctic on things like scientific surveys. So the Chinese are something that, if you look at Canada's big defense and foreign affairs and Arctic policies, we're more and more concerned about the work that's being done from their vastly expanded icebreaker fleet. They're up to 3 icebreakers right now. They're about to have 4. Give them a couple years, and they actually may have a nuclear-powered icebreaker. The Chinese icebreaker fleet right now is bigger than the American fleet, so expanding exponentially. And on the left-hand side, this is kind of neat. You can see about a dozen years of research operations. So these are AIS tracks. So it's a satellite track of where the ship went. And I think what you can see pretty clearly is what area the Chinese are really interested in, the area west and north of Alaska. So all kinds of research being done there, much of which is civilian, legitimate, absolutely. But over the last 5 years in particular, you've got all kinds of new potential military applications, hydrographic work, salinity studies, basically all of the studies the US did in the 1950s and 60s to prepare for submarine operations, the Chinese are doing right now. And then, of course, you've got all of this new tech, buoys, gliders, uncrewed vessels, right? Drones that go 1,000 kilometers under the ice and come back, studying the seafloor for potential seabed mining operations in the future. Again, none of this is a security concern today, but the Americans and the Canadian government are very worried about what this is setting the table for over the long run. Even the Russians are a little worried about this. On the right-hand map there, you've got a little area in red called Gakkel Ridge. So several years back, the Chinese announced that they were going to send one of their icebreakers, the Shuilong 2, up to Gakkel Ridge to do some geological surveys. That same month, the Russians extended their continental shelf claim, their extended continental shelf claim, to cover Gakkel Ridge because they knew the Chinese were going. They wanted to sort of basically plant the flag before that Chinese icebreaker got there. That's right there. So these are kind of the conventional slash hybrid threats. About a year back, year and a half, the Canadian government found a buoy dropped by one of those Chinese icebreakers. I don't know what was on it. It's classified, but I have been told it's a multi-sensor buoy. There's lots of stuff on it, kind of like that big balloon that was floating through the North American airspace a year back. It was enough that the military was worried about what was on this buoy. So you've got this expanding Russian and Chinese Arctic capability, marine scientific research that's now doing all kinds of potentially military applicable things, and then very clear evidence that both of these adversaries are both there and looking to expand their role over the long term. So those are the big conventional security, safety, and defense threats that are emerging. Now they're related to sovereignty, like I talked about earlier, but they're different. Right? So a Chinese icebreaker doesn't actually challenge Canadian sovereignty. Sovereignty is a legal political question. But as Canada develops its Arctic policies and is doing more and more up in the region, which it is, the big questions that are emerging are how do we defend the Arctic from defense threats? How do we deal with those nebulous security threats that aren't actually defense threats? You can't tell the Chinese to not be there. They have a right under international law to be there. But how do you manage that to make sure that it doesn't turn into a defense threat? And then, of course, how do you manage all of these security, safety, defense issues within a legal and political environment where your biggest ally, the United States, not only doesn't recognize your ownership of your own waters, but is now, in a bizarre turn of events, looking to annex your Arctic neighbors and potentially even looking to challenge your position in the North. So it is a very dynamic environment that is changing constantly, evolving rapidly. And this is what the Canadian government has to manage. So it's a very difficult situation. And if you ask me where we will be in 10 years from now, my best answer is predicting the future is a fool's errand. Things are changing so quickly. So thanks very much for listening. I'm very happy to take as many questions as you have on any subject relating to the North. Thanks very much. I'll stop the screen share here.
questions, please come to the microphone and ask your questions, and everybody will hear them.
Adam, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. We're all here still thinking of questions, but I do have one question. Could you tell us a little bit about the current role of the Arctic Council?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Arctic Council is an organization which brings together the Arctic states, indigenous permanent participants from across the whole circumpolar Arctic, from Russia to Canada, as well as a series of observers, the Chinese, the Indians, a whole collection of groups with an interest in the North who aren't Arctic countries. And the purpose of the Arctic Council as a governance council is to look at issues of environmental security, transportation, safety, search and rescue. They do a lot of very deep research on shipping, black carbon, biodiversity, and their work is informative for government policy. They don't look at security. That's the one thing they're mandated not to look at. Now, the Arctic Council was paused in 2022 after the Russian invasion, or the second invasion of Ukraine. And essentially, what all of the Western governments and indigenous governments said was we can't engage with Russia on any formal level. And so the organization wasn't disbanded, it was paused. Now, over the last 3 years, it's gradually restarted at the working group levels. So what that means is all of the practical research work being done on shipping and environmental protection and whatnot, that's started to roll again. But what is not happening is the state level engagement between the Canadians, the Norwegians, and the Russian government. That's part of our unwillingness to deal with the Russians on a state-to-state level. So the Arctic Council is still going forward. It's still very important. Canadian policy came out recently and said, yes, this is still the central governing body. One of the concerns, however, and one of the reasons we're keeping this going, even if we're not talking to the Russians, is every Arctic state is very worried about what would replace it if the Arctic Council died. So if the Arctic Council went away, something would fill the vacuum. And that would probably be something that the Arctic states didn't like, because it would probably be a new international council organization of some sort, which the Chinese, the Indians, the EU had a much bigger stake in. And that is something the Canadians don't want, the Russians don't want. Arctic states have historically been very firm that the Arctic governance questions are managed by the Arctic states. So that's where the Arctic Council is at right now. It's continuing its work, but is still very limited in the political role that it can play at the top level.
Adam, we have a couple of questions from people who are in our virtual audience. The first one is interesting one. Your thoughts on Trump's Golden Dome idea?
So I don't really have many thoughts because no one really knows what it is. So if you ask me what the Golden Dome is, no one can tell you what the technology is, what the arrangement is, what participation would be for Canada. It's based on the Israeli Iron Dome concept. However, the threats it's dealing with are fundamentally different. So the Israelis have had phenomenal success in homeland defense against Hezbollah, Hamas, Iranian weapons. Now, the difference, however, is that those weapons attacking Israel are, for the most part, a very slow-moving drones or rockets. Simply put, they're very easy to shoot down, relatively speaking. The threats to North America are radically different. Those threats are hypersonic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, or cruise missiles. which are hard to detect, extraordinarily, in some cases impossible to shoot down with current technology. So the Israeli comparison is often used, like we'll just put that here. Doesn't work that way. The technology is completely different. The threats are completely different. The thought is, in some unofficial circles, the US will do what Reagan wanted to do in the 80s, which is to weaponize space, which is illegal right now under the Outer Space Treaty. But you could theoretically still do that. You would put interceptor missiles onto a Starship, right? One of Elon Musk's big guys, and use that to shoot down missiles as they're ascending from North Korea, China, Russia, wherever. So that's the thinking. That's the difficulty. But if anyone tells you that they understand what the Golden Dome is, they're probably lying or they're breaking classified clearances.
Thank you. That's the best explanation I've ever heard. The next question comes, first, thanks you for your presentation. And do you have any insight regarding Trudeau the Younger saying that an Arctic ambassador will be appointed? There has not been any announcement at this point.
Yes. I can only tell you what I know, which is they are going to do that. They're moving forward. Things move slowly in government. That process was interrupted by the election, obviously. So right now, as I understand it, which is very limited understanding, I have no inside knowledge here, is they are finding someone and moving to appoint them. But like I said, very slow moving. They have to find funding. Funding has to go through Treasury Board. That's a long process. And then the election through everything for a loop. And then Carney's got to find, his approach. So my best understanding is that's going forward, but, multiple bureaucratic hoops to go through.
If I'm not mistaken, I understand that the United Nations Convention Law of the Sea has not been ratified by the USA. Is that right? And
Yes,
that
correct.
is the convention that regulates mineral rights under the sea.
Mhm.
So are they doing some kind of dance as well there? I mean, why have they not ratified, and what's going on there?
Yeah, so that gets really complicated. So the oceans constitution, which governs free transit, territorial waters, seabed usage, fishing, everything to do with the oceans, was the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, ratified in 1982. The US didn't sign it. The US was very active in negotiating it, but when it came down to it, the critical issue was seabed resources and the right to mine seabed resources. And the UNCLOS agreement gave the UN much more power in regulating that in the in the high seas than the US was comfortable with. And so for that reason, the US under Reagan didn't sign the agreement. So today, the US does recognize UNCLOS. They have said that, like, we're not signing this, but we recognize that this is the law of the sea. So nobody in Washington would tell you that this is not the law of the sea. But as you said, now we're looking at deep seabed mining. And so does the US get to do this, or how does the US operate deep seabed mining operations outside of the UNCLOS provisions? It's a little bit sketchy. It's hard to say. And over the last 10 years, there's been different parts of the US Senate that have been pushing to get the US to sign on to UNCLOS. And there's no good reason not to. It's mostly politics because I shouldn't say no, many US senators in particular don't like the visuals of a UN sort of world government legal system. I think a lot of it is more political and visual than legal. So nobody is doing deep seabed mining right now, but there are lots of companies that are testing it. And that's going to be one of the big questions over the next several years is how this unfolds practically.
Everyone good here? Come.
Would you care to comment on the phenomenon of climate change, which particularly we understand affects the Arctic, and whether that enables some of these activities that you're talking about or has any impact or any role to play? Thank you.
Well, of course, it has enormous roles to play. So climate change is affecting the Arctic at a rate of about 3 to 4 times more than southern latitudes. So the ice is melting quite rapidly, but not only is the ice melting, it's becoming thinner and thinner. So even when you've got complete ice coverage, 100% coverage, that ice is actually much easier to break through than it would have been 40 years ago. So in that sense, it's much safer. Areas are much more open than they would have been decades ago. That being said, it's still not safe. Sort of a curious feature is that in many ways in the summer it's become less safe because ice has melted in the Arctic archipelago, if you can visualize that sort of triangular archipelago. So all that ice has melted, and that has allowed much thicker, more dangerous ice from the Arctic Ocean sort of come down and plug up the straits of the archipelago, creating new navigational hazards. So it's opening, but the idea that this is an easy, open sea route that is predictable, it's not. It's definitely not. You've also, of course, got permafrost melt, which means that a lot of the land is becoming unstable and much harder to build on. Previously, frozen permafrost, you could drive a pile into it and build a house on that. Now it's becoming sort of a slushy muskeg and it's wrecking infrastructure. So transport across the Arctic land is actually becoming harder as it gets warmer because this permafrost is melting ice roads. So on the one hand, yes, the area is opening up, less ice, easier ice, but it's also becoming more complex and less predictable.
Another question, what is the representation of the indigenous people of the Arctic in the discussions and concerns that are ongoing?
Well, it would depend, I think, on what the venue is or what the issue is. So we talked about the Arctic Council already. That's a regional forum for discussing safety, security, economic development issues. The indigenous peoples of each Arctic state, and some are international organizations, have formal positions as permanent participants engaging with those issues very directly. Now, let's just look at the Canadian national perspective. You've got multiple different avenues of representation, consultation, and basically avenues to weigh in on policy development or economic development. So you've got territorial governments, right, which are depending on the territory, largely indigenous run. You've got territorial land claims organizations. You've got different indigenous corporations that are engaged in questions of economic development. If you're looking at federal policy development, so Canadian Arctic policy took, 5 years to develop the Arctic Northern Arctic ANPF, the Arctic Northern Policy Framework. Took half a decade to develop, and a big reason for that was the extensive consultation across the North. It took years and years. It was actually something called a co-developed process. So rather than simply going to the North and saying, what do you think? And then taking those ideas back, and then the bureaucrats in Ottawa writing the policy, it was an attempt to co-author our Northern policy with Northerners, Indigenous groups, relevant actors, rights, and stakeholders. It met with mixed success. maybe it was too ambitious. It took too long because, of course, different Indigenous groups don't always agree on what our policy should be. Same thing, of course, with defense, foreign policy. You've got very clear, very structured consultative processes there. If you're talking about economic development, then there's multi-year long processes by which you talk about impact benefit agreements. There's all kinds of different engagement with local communities to ensure that there's jobs and benefits and cultural considerations. So at sort of every level of development, everything from building a mine up to sort of the high level regional governance structures, you have a lot of informal and a lot of very formal systems of consultation and engagement with communities, territorial governments, Indigenous organizations writ large.
Dr. Lucian, thank you so much for taking time to share with the Seniors College your knowledge of the situation in the North. I've learned a lot today. I thank you so much because I'm sure I thought I understood sovereignty in the North. You've had lots of thank yous on the chat line. And again, thank you so much for giving us your time.
Oh, absolutely. Happy to be here.